Why do these games have to be so expensive? And why does it seem like every game that I like or want to play is in the top tier of prices? Maybe I just have great taste. Or maybe retro gaming has become a huge fad, and half the population wants to have an entire wall covered with shelves of classic games. I know we could take an entire episode talking about the causes of ballooning prices, but that's not what this video is about. Today, I'd like to introduce some games that differ greatly in price, depending on whether you're looking for the American or the Japanese version. Now, first of all, RPGs are disqualified from this video because the English versions are just way more expensive across the board. It would take forever to go over all of them. 16 and 32-bit RPGs in Japan are all in the bargain bin. Learn Japanese. So let's get into it. First, I want to look at Megaman 5, which is called Rockman 5 in Japan. To my amazement, Megaman 5 is the most expensive NES Mega Man game in North America, costing even $200 or more depending on the box. Guess what? The Japanese version of Mega Man 5 is the cheapest Mega Man game on the NES or Famicom. A complete copy in good condition sells for around $25, and for some reason I won an auction for it for only $12, with the box in more or less perfect condition. I was under the impression that it's cheaper because it's the easiest Mega Man game. Still an excellent addition to the series, and I think it has the second best soundtrack of any Mega Man game. Next, let's take a look at Space Megaforce, or Super Aleste in Japan. This is an excellent shooter by Compile for the SNES. I understand a complete copy of the North American version with a good box can go for well over $300. While it is a good enough game to be worth that kind of money, the Japanese version must have been pressed in higher numbers, because it generally sells for $65 in great condition. With how expensive NES and SNES games can be, thanks to how easy it is to damage those boxes, it's nice to have one of the best games for the system be so affordable. Moving on, I recently learned something that shocked me big time. The North American version of Skullmonkeys has shot up in price a bit, costing $80 or more depending on how well the case has been cared for. Now it's true, that reflective hologram they used for the cover is badass, but if you can do without it, you can have the Japanese version for between $5 and $10. I honestly have no idea why no one cares about it here. It's one of the best platformers I've ever played. It's as good as any Japanese developed game in every aspect. I can still sing that bonus level song from memory. So far I've talked about games that are expensive in America and relatively cheap in Japan. But there are plenty of examples of the opposite, so let's take a look at some of those. Remember that game Bubsy, the bobcat with the attitude? It seemed cool at the time. If you go back to it now, I think most people will find there's not much going on in the gameplay department. Apparently the Japanese release was very limited, because I just watched a complete copy sell for around $270 on Yahoo Auctions, and I know stores are asking for way more. The US version is, appropriately, rather cheap for an action game, maybe $35 or $40. What idiot paid that much to play Bubsy? Hey look, it's Castlëvānia Bloodlines for the Genesis. I own the American version. Wanna know why? Because the Japanese version costs $500 godforsaken dollars! You would think with how popular the Castlëvānia franchise was that they would make plenty of copies. There's just one little issue. The Sega Genesis wasn't all that popular in Japan. I know the Genesis and Super Nintendo were neck and neck in America, but the SNES utterly dominated in Japan. The TurboGrafx may have actually outsold the Genesis here. And Bloodlines was released in 1994. That's the tail end of the Genesis's lifespan. The Sega Saturn would come out later the same year. It's a good game, but not the best Castlevania game by any means. Good thing the US version is only around $100. I know I said I wanted to avoid RPGs for this video, but I think Terranigma is definitely worth mentioning. Terranigma was the third game in a trilogy of action RPGs for the Super Nintendo made by Quintet, the first two being Soul Blazer and Illusion of Gaia. It was a very ambitious project for a company with limited resources, and is generally critically acclaimed. It was properly translated into English, but for some reason only released in Europe. North Americans missed out. I'm guessing it's because the game's presentation of historical events is, well, rather inaccurate. Probably due to the lack of a US version, the European title has become something of a trophy. A complete copy can easily sell for $400. The Japanese version, called Tenchi Sozo, which basically translates to the creation of heaven and earth, is somewhere between $35 and $40, a mere 1/10 of the price. I'd like to finish off this list with a little Famicom game called Dragon Fighter. Yeah, Dragon Fighter. You don't know Dragon Fighter? Actually, that's perfectly understandable. Not only had I never played Dragon Fighter growing up, I had never even heard of it until about a year and a half ago. And I lived through the 8-bit era and had Nintendo Power. Obviously, they didn't expect this game to sell very well in America, and on top of that, there was no European release. I actually think Dragon Fighter is one of Natsume's best games. I would choose it over Shadow of the Ninja in a heartbeat. A complete copy in good condition can easily cost $500 or more, and with how few copies there are, I can actually understand it being expensive in this case. Or, you could just pick up the Japanese version for a whopping $40. That's right, in Japan, Dragon Fighter isn't a highly sought after game. It was $40 a year ago when I bought it, and it's still $40. It's reassuring to know that not every hidden gem costs half a month's salary. There are a lot of other games that could go into this list, but I'm gonna wrap up here for today. Since most of the things I introduced were platformers or shooters, you could probably save a lot of money by importing the cheaper version and just playing it with a converter. Unless you're desperate to have the entire set of every single North American SNES game, then you're fucked. You poor devils. That is going to be the end of this video for today. Thanks a lot for staying to the end. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, because this is the place where the fun never ends. See you next time.